Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, the Jewish Community Relations Director of the Des Moines Jewish Federation.
Hello, David.
And welcome.
Thank you so much.
And we're going to be talking about the Israeli coalition building and the issues that are coming up right now for Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, as he tries to put together a coalition, and what those impacts are. Before we do that, I'd like to offer my special thanks to Dr. Ron Bergman of Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery for his patronage of this show, his support of this show, so that we can share the information with the world. And so, Mark, what is going on with the Israeli elections here, the Israeli coalition building?
Well, the election itself was held on January 22nd. And then there comes a time when the president of Israel looks at the election results, and he looks at the front runner, the front party, and whose front runner is the head of that party, and says to him, you have a certain number of days, about 45 days, to put together a coalition for the Knesset, which means out of the 120 seats in the parliament, one needs 61 seats as a minimum to have a majority, and then the horse trading begins.
And the issues that the coalition is based on range anything from economic issues like we would have here, foreign policy issues, but there also are religious-related issues that come up. Big news this week is that Tzipi Livni, who was the direct rival for Netanyahu in the past Knesset, has already agreed to join the coalition, whatever coalition Benjamin Netanyahu is able to create this time around.
Right.
With expressed point of view, expressed a goal of restarting the peace process, from what I understand.
That seems to be the case. It's said almost cynically in the press that Ms. Livni has staked her political career on restarting the peace process. Now, she was the head of Kadima at one juncture, which was the political party started by Ariel Sharon about 5, 6, 7 years ago that drew members, the more liberal members from the Likud party and some of the centrists and liberals from the left-wing parties, so that a new party could be formed. It's not, the electoral system in Israel, as you know, David, has multiple parties, up to 30 parties running at a time. And what did we look at? We saw that something like 12 parties made the cut, meaning that each one of those party lines drew at least 1% of the electoral vote, and therefore, for each 1%, they're entitled to one person sitting in the Knesset.
And we have this strange situation in which Americans believe that we have the most democratic country in the world. We have two parties in our Congress, plus some independents. I guess there may be. Is there any socialist members? I think there.
Well, Bernie Sanders. So
comparing that to 12 political parties in Israel, is not close. I think you have to have 2% of the vote or something like that to be elected
in Israel.
Yeah,
it's only 1%.
Well, it's to have your party is at 1 point something percent.
Yeah, it's
more than
1%.
It's but it's very low. The bar to be represented is very low. And Israel has people in its government who are essentially or in the Knesset, I should say, not in the coalition, but in the Knesset, who are hostile to the way the state even exists. You have three different Arab parties, some of which are Marxist parties, some of which are in favor of keeping Israel the way it is, but some of them are in favor of modifying Israel heavily and working with Palestinians to even create a single state. So Israel has a very vibrant political system, and add to that, we talk about separation of church and state in this country, and those who are religious fundamentalists in this country believe that they don't have as strong a voice as they'd like to have. Well, look at Israel. What goes on in Israel, Mark?
Well, you have basically a monopoly controlled by some of the religious parties, partly because their participation in the coalition is so valuable that the politicians are likely not to change the status quo meaning that a lot of funding and a lot of privileges seem to go to the ultra-religious parties. Would you agree?
Yes. In Israel, you essentially have a situation in which the government funds religious entities throughout the country. They give funding to churches. They give funding to mosques. They give funding to all the religious institutions, including synagogues. Now, the issue with synagogues is there's disputes between whether all the money should go to the Orthodox streams of Judaism or to the more progressive streams of Judaism, like the one I belong to, the Reform movement or the conservative movement.
Now, David, ultimately that decision, because it's a controversial decision, belongs to the Israeli people to decide. And I think one of the common wisdom of the day is that the secular Israelis, which number about, 83% of the country?
Something like that, yes.
Simply don't care.
Well, and they're starting to care more. I mean, this was the first election I think we really had a significant discussion of pluralism, and it came from the Yesh Atid party, which is left of center. And as we're talking about what the current status of the coalition is, let's get into that. So Benjamin Netanyahu heads a party called Israel Beitenu, Likud Israel Beitenu. Okay, Likud Israel Beitenu. Netanyahu himself was the head of the Likud party. Avigdor Lieberman was head of Israel Beitenu, meaning Israel is our home. And the Avigdor Lieberman and Benjamin Netanyahu combined their parties into one party for this election. The Kadima on the left ended up splitting into, really, if you look at the election, they really ended up splitting into several different parties, with Kadima itself only having 2 votes. But Tzipi Livni's Hot Nuah party actually got 6 votes and is there on the left.
Which was pretty significant to have 6 votes.
Yes, I mean,
for an individual, basically, she has a list of people in her party, but she's probably the most famous. And number 2 is it the Mitznah, perhaps? Somebody else that's a name.
I'm not entirely sure who else is connected there.
Okay.
So we have this situation in which the coalition needs to get 61 votes. On the political right, the far political right, you have the Jewish Home Party led by Naftali Bennett. Jewish Home believes that all of the land, the biblical land of Israel, belongs to the Jews. Right. This is what is currently recognized as Israel from post-1949, but additionally the West Bank, which is was part of Jordan at that point, and it was taken over by Israel after the 1967 war, in which the Palestinian people claim as their part of their homeland.
Well, David, tell how that fits into the scope of the right wing.
Yeah. So as we're looking at the coalition is generally set up as a. Well, there are different issues that form the basis of this. So what we've got with Jewish Home is really a settler party. It's a party that is more on the secular side, although they do certainly have religious settlers, that wants to support the settlements entirely, the entire settlement enterprise. Just to their left, I would say, politically, are the two Haredi parties, the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, although ultra-Orthodox really is not an accurate description of them. They're really Haredim, ultra-religious or something along those lines. The two political parties that are there are Shas, which is the Arab Jewish party, the Yemenite
Sephardic.
origin party,
Yeah.
Sephardic origin party,
Yeah.
and United Torah Judaism, which is a smaller party of the ultra Orthodox. They tend to go along with the right wing, and they're natural partners with Likud on the right wing. So when people saw the way that this election played out, many people expected a Israel Beitenu Likud main party with 31 seats. They expected Shas and United Torah Judaism with a combined 18 between the two of them, and a Jewish Home Party with 12, forming a coalition of 61 seats. And if anybody else wanted to join, more power to them. If that was the case, then anybody on the left joining is just gravy because he's got a party.
But that's not what happened.
But that's not what's going on.
Because the first person that jumped into the ring was Tzipi Livni from a centrist party. And the reason she was attractive to the coalition is because she brought 6 seats with her, obviously. And the first deal was what? What did she get in return?
So Tzipi Livni of Hatnuah negotiated with Benjamin Netanyahu to receive essentially, well, she received the justice portfolio, which is something that she really wanted to do, dealing with the judicial system in Israel. But she also wanted to oversee the peace process. And so rather than giving her the foreign ministry portfolio, Benjamin Netanyahu essentially created a portfolio in and of itself to work on the peace process. So it doesn't matter who ends up being the foreign minister. They won't be in charge of negotiating peace with the Palestinians. Tzipi Livni will be, which is actually a good thing for those who are interested in the peace process. This is a very positive thing. Tzipi Livni has been working on the peace process for quite a while. She is somebody who knows the leaders of the Palestinians, and she's someone with whom the American political leadership is familiar and can work. So that all bodes well for there actually to be negotiations going forward. However, there are some monkey wrenches in the coalition here because Tzipi Livni is perfectly willing to work with the ultra-Orthodox, and there's another issue that comes up, the Haredi parties. The issue that comes up is something called national service. Israelis all are supposed to serve in the government somehow, some way. Most of them serve in the military. And people who don't serve in the military do other forms of what's called national service so that they can give of themselves to the country, and everybody is responsible for doing that. Everybody except the Haredim, who believe that studying in a yeshiva is the religious responsibility of Jews, and that Israel as a Jewish state must support them in that effort. But not only do they go beyond that. I heard recently from an Orthodox rabbi who basically said that Israel's very survival is miraculous, and the whole reason that it has survived is because God wants to support the continued studies of these ultra-Orthodox students.
Well, that's certainly a very mystical understanding.
It's a mystical understanding. Yeah. But this is really where they're coming from. These parties really believe that God wants them to do this, and that God is blessing the nation of Israel because the nation of Israel allows them to do it. So the argument that's being made, and it's coming not just from the left wing, it's coming from the right wing, that everybody needs to serve
in their own way,
in some way,
yes,
is coming across as very problematic for them. So you have 18 votes, 18 seats in the Knesset that are opposed to national service. You now have Naftali Bennett's 12 seats with the Jewish Home Party in an alliance with the newly formed Yesh Atid party, the Yesh Atid party led by Yair Lapid, which came out of nowhere. It's a brand new party in this election that is a center-right, a centrist party. I don't know if they're center-right, center, or center-left, but they're in the center. And they seem to have an interest in working with a center-right coalition. But what's most interesting is this agreement between Yesh Atid and Jewish Home to advocate for national service for all Israelis or to stay out of the coalition. So what's the impact of that, Mark?
Well, the impact is that it makes it very difficult to put together a coalition in the first place. And the people are going to have to either trade in on their principles to do something very rational, or, David, would you agree that if they can't put a coalition together, there'll be another election, most likely?
So what's happening right now is that Benjamin Netanyahu, by negotiating with Tzipi Livni and Hatnuah, with the likely willingness of Kadima to join the coalition, bringing another 2 seats, and with the ultra-Orthodox in the coalition, the 18 seats of the coalition, and the 31 from Israel Beitenu Likud,
still fall short.
He's got 57 seats. That's not enough.
That's not enough.
That's not enough.
And so what would he possibly do to attract others to that form of the coalition? I'm not sure.
This is the real issue is, will one of the other 2 parties be willing to concede something on national service, or will the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties be forced to concede on national service? And we'll talk a little bit about some of their reactions after our break.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Drink, dance, party. Kitty's is the ultimate dance club in Des Moines. A huge dance floor with room to move, 3 bars to keep your drinks full, and kickin' DJs playing all your favorite dance music. At Kitty's, we've always got your birthday party planned with Birthday Fridays. That's right, when your birthday rolls around, there's only one place to go. Gather up your friends and head to Kitty's, where you drink free on the Friday of your birthday week. Find out more about Birthday Fridays at kittiesusa.com. Kitty's, all kinds of people, all kinds of music, all kinds of fun.
Drug and alcohol addiction slowly steals a person's identity, tearing away pieces of their life little by little until one day it seems like the hope of a happy future is gone and there's no chance of getting it back. Here at St. Gregory Retreat Centers, we can assure you that there is hope. Our unique approach to recovery begins with the understanding that the dysfunction and damage caused by addiction can be overcome, not just dealt with. Don't let another day go by. Call St. Gregory today.
Whether you're 10, 25, 50, 80 years old and beyond, everyone needs to live within their means. I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America. For almost a quarter of a century, we've helped people of all ages learn to manage their personal finances to benefit them far into the future. When problems arise, we've got the experience you need to make those debt problems go away. Got financial problems? Call Consumer Credit of America.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined by Mark Finkelstein, the Jewish Community Relations Director from the Des Moines Jewish Federation. And we're talking about the Israeli coalition and what the nature of the coalition is and what the challenges are. And I have to share something with you. When I started speculating about what the coalition would look like, one of my good friends who knows far more about Israeli politics than the vast majority of people said, one thing I don't do is speculate on the coalition, because no matter what you say today, you're going to be wrong tomorrow. And just to give you an example of this, the Hatnuah party agreed to join the coalition. One of the major players in the Hatnuah party is a guy named Amir Peretz, who was part of the Labor Party. And Amir Peretz joined Hatnuah, at least explicitly, because the leader of the Labor Party in Israel, Sheli Yakimovich, refused to declare working with Netanyahu in a coalition out of bounds. So here, Amir Peretz is now going to be the environmental minister in the coalition, assuming this coalition moves forward. Israeli politics is nothing if not entertaining.
The other aspect is that these people who are elected to the parliament have no particular constituency. Can you explain that, David? Meaning, in the United States, you elect a congressman for a particular district, and they go back and they talk to their constituents. In England or Canada, they're elected to ridings, but in Israel, they're elected on a nationalist national platform and have no particular responsibility for going to their people who live in their hometown and representing them. How do you feel about that?
Well, it certainly creates a different kind of system. I mean, when you're in Israel, you don't really feel the same kind of geographical divide, I think, that you feel here. And people in Tel Aviv feel connected to Jerusalem. They feel connected to the north. They feel connected to the south. I think as the secular religious divide widens, however, that may change somewhat. I mean, you could certainly see that United Torah Judaism and Shas are more concerned with the cities that have a large religious population than they are with the cities that have no religious population. And the kibbutzim, the former socialist enclaves certainly tend toward labor.
Yes, they do.
And then there's some nationalist places that tend more toward Likud.
And so their input is simply in casting their vote for the party that best represents their general interests.
And because they have such a variety of parties that they can vote for and picking platforms, really they can find somebody who's going to support the vast majority of their interests and their needs.
And the marijuana party did not make it into the Knesset this time.
No, I mean it didn't make it last time either. But there is one. There are single issue parties and some of the single issue parties actually have done pretty well. I mean, you certainly have the religious parties.
Well, the pensioner.
They're primarily a religious issue. There have been in the past, retiree parties. As Mark mentioned, the pensioners party. There have been parties dealing with
ethnic background,
dealing with settlements. Jewish Home is basically a settlers party. You had Israel Beitenu itself was a Russian immigrant party. Mm-hmm. So the Israeli political system provides a whole host of discussion topics. Israelis tend to talk about religion and politics as the taboo topics. That tends to be what they talk about most of the time.
Well, David, let me ask you, going back to Tzipi Livni, who's a very popular person and comes to the United States every now and then.
I've met her. She's a wonderful person.
Absolutely. Why did Netanyahu accept her first into the picture, which creates other problems?
I think that she's brought into the coalition first because Netanyahu needs to threaten Jewish Home with creating a coalition that's further to the left. Because Benjamin Netanyahu could create a coalition that doesn't include Jewish Home, doesn't include United Torah Judaism, just includes Shas, which tends to be more moderate, especially on social issues, and more willing to allow Likud to do whatever it wants. Historically, Shas has been part of virtually every coalition, the reason for that is because they don't prioritize they have not prioritized the economic issues, and they haven't prioritized the foreign policy issues, which means the major issues that coalitions have been based around have not been part of their issue, and they're perfectly willing to work with Labor, and they're perfectly willing to work with Likud.
Well,
so Netanyahu could form a Likud, Israel Beitenu, Shas coalition along with Hatnuah, Kadima, and either the Labor Party or Yesh Atid if he wanted to. And so there is some pressure on Bennett. And if Bennett doesn't come into this coalition, the question would be, and Netanyahu has to call new elections, will that mean that Bennett will suffer? Will Jewish Home lose votes? Because if it's not going to come into a right-wing coalition, and it's really about the social issue of national service, they may well lose votes.
Well, the last time something like this happened was in the prior Israeli election, in which Tzipi Livni actually outpolled Likud. And the first thing that happened is that Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, first approached Ms. Livni and said, you have an opportunity to build your coalition. After about a month or 2 months, it wasn't happening. So instead of calling new elections, he went ahead then and approached Netanyahu and says, it's your turn. Do you think necessarily there has to be new elections at this juncture? And whose discretion do you think it would be?
Well, I mean, here's the deal. It's fairly clear if you look at the way the system is set up right now, that Yesh Atid doesn't have the ability to create its own coalition without one of the ultra-Orthodox parties or Likud.
But does it have a right to try?
Well, it has a right to try, but if it's impossible, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I have the right to do all kinds of things, but if I can't do them, what good is it? If you add up all the votes that could possibly support that coalition, you don't get enough to form a coalition.
Right.
So you can't really have a center-left coalition that's going to work without
one of the religious,
without Shas,
without one of the religious parties,
which basically means that the whole coalition building is coming down to this issue of national service, because as long as Yesh Atid and Jewish Home are going to insist on national service.
That's the primary issue out there right now.
And Netanyahu is loath to engage in that. And the reason he's loath to engage in that is because if he goes that direction, the Orthodox supporters are probably going to tail away from his party after that. That's a compromise that's going to hurt Likud. It's not a compromise that's likely to help Likud.
And that particular topic trumped the topic that Lapid was elected on, I think. I think most people were attracted to Yesh Atid because of its social economic programs rather than the conscription issue.
And that is where Netanyahu is banking right now. The problem is that if you really look at this, since Lapid came out of nowhere,
except for the fact that he was a known person on media.
Yair Lapid was an anchor person who was well known throughout Israel. It'd be kind of like if Tom Brokaw ran for
he'd probably be elected
during his
too.
prime. So
yeah,
but the issue here is that if Netanyahu were to call a new election, it would greatly benefit Lapid. There's a very good possibility that Lapid's party could grow and grow and grow, and that Lapid could end up forming the coalition himself after.
Well, the scuttlebutt is people are saying if I had known that Lapid would have done so well, I would have voted for him.
Yeah, I mean, and that's so the issue that's coming up here is that Netanyahu really does not want to send this to a new election. And the person who would probably have the most to lose actually is not Netanyahu but Bennett, because if Bennett's party were to force a new election, and to do so because he refused to participate in a right-leaning coalition, and in favor of national service, which he's got, I'm sure, some constituents who or at least supporters who supported him simply because of his stance about the settlements and not necessarily on this stuff.
That's right.
He could potentially lose quite a bit.
Just to summarize, what brought Lapid to prominence seems to have been the fact that the right wing went more to the right.
Yes, and so Likud, prior to the election, named a slate of members of the Knesset, and that's how it works. You name a long list of members of the Knesset, you rank them, and then depending on what percentage of the vote you get, certain number of people down on that list get in.
And the others don't.
And the others don't get in.
Yeah.
So what happened is that Likud ranked its Knesset members before the election, and Benjamin Netanyahu basically was the liberal on the list.
Which is hard for many people to conceive.
Well, yeah, and he's definitely not the leftmost person on the right wing in Israel. So there became, or to the right of center. So it became a situation in which there's a gap between the center and where Likud was.
Right.
And Yesh Atid seems to have filled that gap. And at least taken on some of those people. They've also certainly brought people from the left.
Absolutely, yes. Which gives it a different tinge.
So the way things are looking right now is it basically all depends on whether or not Jewish Home is going to insist on this national service issue. Because the second they concede on that, you're looking at a 69-member coalition.
Now, the scuttlebutt is this is all going to come down within the next number of days.
Well, it has to. There's a time limit on how long this stuff can go. So you're looking at the decision being made in the next few days to whether or not Netanyahu has the ability to create a coalition or we're going to go to new elections. I would tend to think at this point, because of the political situation, that Bennett is more likely to concede somewhat and say, I fought the good fight and we'll fight it another day and go into the coalition, instead of saying, I'm going to go down guns blazing, which is kind of what
self-defeating.
Is not going to help him, and
it's not going to help the country either.
And so, from the perspective of, is it better for his settlers, the settlers who he represents, to have a center-right coalition, or to have new elections with a potential center-left coalition? There's no doubt there for him. And so I think he's going to concede and go into a coalition. If I had to guess, I would say that's what's going to happen in the next little bit.
This seems to be a good transition point to talk about Obama's coming to Israel.
Yes. Okay. So you want to introduce that a little bit, Mark?
Okay. It's the second term that President Obama is serving. During his first term, he was criticized, whether fairly or unfairly, by people that he didn't come to Israel, even though he made different appearances in the Middle East and Egypt. And it would have been nice, frankly, if he had just traveled another 30 miles north and come and spoken to the Israeli people. Now, he had been in Israel prior to his first election, and we remember the pictures of Mr. Obama at the Kotel, the wall, praying at that site and inserting his wish. We don't know what his wish that he inserted into the wall was, but maybe he got it because he was elected a second time. So this is an announced trip to the Middle East, and it's scheduled for the middle of March. And one of the questions, David, is about the Secretary of State, John Kerry. How do you see that playing into any of this?
Well, and he's not going to Israel.
That's correct.
Senator Kerry is not going there. Secretary Kerry is not going to Israel. The situation is this. You could make the argument that the president can't just go to Israel just to visit Israel. There's got to be something more to it. There's so many issues that are coming up that for the president to take the time to go to Israel and not have anything that he can really put forth as a policy plan is not beneficial for him. That
and he's not.
And so the question this time is he going to try to jumpstart the peace process, which some people believe that he is, or is there something else on the agenda? I tend to think there's something else on the agenda, and I tend to think that also by the fact that John Kerry is going to these other countries, that they're really trying to hit all of the major countries in the region all at once at a time when Syria is in major turmoil. And we've talked about that. But it's not just Syria that's in major turmoil. You've got a situation in Egypt right now, which is totally flying under the radar because of the situation in Syria, in which the Egyptian military is saying we may have to step in.
Yeah, they're not so happy with Morsi either at this juncture.
And if the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt were to collapse and a military coup take its place, that has some significant impact too. Meanwhile, you've got militants flowing in from all over the place into multiple different countries in the region. There was a discussion the other day that you have not only the Chechen fighters and other fighters coming into Syria, but you have fighters coming into Sudan from Mali and all kinds of other places.
As rest and relaxation.
And so there's a confluence of majorly problematic things going on in the Middle East. We'll talk more about the impact of the president's visit to the Middle East and what we think might happen after our break.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Whether you're 10, 25, 50, 80 years old and beyond, everyone needs to live within their means. I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America. For almost a quarter of a century, we've helped people of all ages learn to manage their personal finances to benefit them far into the future. When problems arise, we've got the experience you need to make those debt problems go away. Got financial problems? Call Consumer Credit of America.
Drink, dance, party. Kitty's is the ultimate dance club in Des Moines. A huge dance floor with room to move, 3 bars to keep your drinks full, and kickin' DJs playing all your favorite dance music. At Kitty's, we've always got your birthday party planned with Birthday Fridays. That's right, when your birthday rolls around, there's only one place to go. Gather up your friends and head to Kitty's, where you drink free on the Friday of your birthday week. Find out more about Birthday Fridays at kittysusa.com. Kitty's, all kinds of people, all kinds of music, all kinds of fun.
If Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of America was your personal webmaster, Tom would filter out all bad debt emails. If Tom was your mailman, you'd never get any debt reduction junk mail. If Tom Coates was a lineman, he'd block any phone calls offering to reduce your credit card debt.
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America, and we're still your best choice for credit counseling. We're local, we're accountable, and we can do more. You make the call when the time's right for you.
When it comes to competition, there really is none for Consumer Credit of America.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman, and I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, the Jewish Community Relations Director for the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines, and we're talking about President Obama's upcoming visit to the Middle East, to Israel, Jordan, and the West Bank. To visit the Palestinians.
Now, it's not usually the case that a president will venture out without knowing exactly what he wants to accomplish. True?
Well, absolutely, it's true. And not only that, I don't think that that's the case here. I think the president has a clear agenda. We just don't know what it is. And I mean, I really think that that's what the case is. But I do not believe, despite the fact that there are people who want to argue that the peace process is at the top of the list here, I don't believe that that's what the primary issue is. I really do believe that the president is going to the three nations that are most impacted by the radicalism and
in the region,
in the
region itself,
and is going to say to them, look, you're in for a rough time here, because no matter what happens in Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and Israel are going to feel an impact of it. If the government in Syria falls and Israel, the United States, and others have to go into Syria to secure weaponry, there's a very high likelihood that they're not going to make it in time to some of the sites where there is chemical and biological weapons. There's a reasonable possibility that some of those could be used, immediately launched against at Israel or used in Jordan to try to undermine the Hashemite kingdom.
Absolutely, any place.
It could be used anywhere, and smuggled into the West Bank and used to try to take down the Palestinian Authority by people who don't like the Palestinian Authority. I mean, there are a number of very obvious, extremely problematic issues that are going on here that I think a lot of people are simply ignoring because they're hopeful about the peace process. If the president can go in, the president may go in to speak to these leaders and say, I'm here to help. Can we make any progress? That's fine. But I think the immediate issue is, here's what's going to happen. Things are going to happen in the next few weeks that are going to cause extreme problems to you. Don't do anything stupid like
lash out
at each other in the meantime. Now, one thing we didn't mention last week, and I think it's important to mention this week, is that in the State of the Union address, the President of the United States has mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian peace for I don't know how long. This year, the President didn't mention the Palestinians. And he mentioned Israel. He didn't mention the Palestinians. And I believe that because at this point there is now a diplomatic problem in how the president can refer to the Palestinians, because the Palestinians themselves are calling themselves the State of Palestine.
I think he could have found a way to around that problem if I thought it was that serious.
I don't think he wants to insult them by calling them Palestinians as such. He can't say the Palestinian Authority, which is the actual title that the United States uses.
He could have said
because
something.
The Palestinians are using this term, State of Palestine.
I think there probably would have been a less political way of referring to the state that was accepted in certain degrees by the UN. If he wanted to, he could have.
How about I was thinking the Palestinian people might be a way around it, but he didn't even do that, and I thought that was interesting. But what's going on right now is that Syria has an enormous amount of chemical, biological weapons and other advanced weaponry. Much of this has come from Russia, some of it from China, some of it probably from North Korea as well.
Absolutely.
And certainly some of it has come from Iran, although the stuff from Iran is lesser than the stuff, as far as the amount of damage that it can do, probably, than the Chinese and Russian stuff. But there's tremendous fear among Israel, the United States, and its allies that any of these weapons will fall into the hands of Hezbollah, which would use them against Israel, into the hands of Al-Qaeda, which is currently battling against the Assad regime in Syria
itself, yes.
And that some of these weapons could get transferred out of Syria, potentially out of that region into Africa, where they could be used all over the place. They could end up into the hands of Hamas, going through Sinai. They could end up being used by the Mali fighters against the government there and against the French. I mean, so the fallout from this is enormous. And I'm starting to believe that the Russians are backing off their position about the Assad regime. I think they're worried right now that the Assad regime is simply not strong enough to stand. And if it falls, they're now wanting to make sure that everything is stable if it falls. And when you've got Chechen fighters sitting there who could bring those chemical and biological weapons into Chechnya,
to their own home territory,
or into Moscow, where Moscow has already had in the past Chechen
the subways
terror attacks,
and the parliament, everything.
You're dealing with a situation that's intolerable for Russia, but Russia cannot side against the Assad regime. So the best bet for Russia at that point would be to bail out and let NATO come in and deal with it. And it could be that this is also what's being told to Israel, that what's being told to Israel is that the U.S. and NATO are making plans to go into Syria, and you need to stay out of it because we don't want you jumping the gun and making sure that we can't secure all of those various sites before the weapons get out. Israel just does not have the capacity to get on the ground and handle all of those things like NATO could do. And so I think
NATO, including Turkey,
because this would be based in Turkey, and to be realistic, Turkey is the one that's probably most directly affected. There's so many different groups that could use weapons against Turkey from that area that they really do have to fear. Even an Islamist government has to fear there,
right?
And the Egyptian government has to fear too. There are a lot of allies for having this stuff taken care of. In the meantime, even Iran is somewhat worried about it. Iran has increased its presence in Syria, increased the support of Hezbollah in Syria because they're also afraid that should the Assad government fall, something will happen in Syria that will be bad for them. Iran is a Shiite government, and these al-Qaeda-backed Sunni militants don't like Iran at all, and could well end up trying to undermine them, if not in Iran, then certainly in Iraq.
Who's very silent these days? Seems like Saudi Arabia has not been particularly vocal.
Saudi Arabia is trying to fly under the radar here, because Saudi Arabia remains one of those places that has been indirectly referred to in multiple speeches by the president about promoting democracy in the Arab world. And here is Saudi Arabia as one of the strongest dictatorships in the Middle East. And to be perfectly honest, right now Saudi Arabia's foreign policy is almost 100% in line with Israel's foreign policy, and they just don't want to say that.
Mm-hmm.
I think politically that would come across as problematic for the Saudi Arabian government, but there's virtually nothing in which they're not in line at this point in dealing with the nations in the Middle East. I mean, they may be slightly different on the peace process, but virtually every other nation they're in the same. They're in agreement with Israel.
Right.
So we're facing a situation in which the Israelis, the Palestinians in the West Bank, and the Jordanians are all in the same boat. And should the government in Syria collapse, not only will you have these weapons flying around, but the regime could well try to derail a NATO invasion by firing rockets at Jordan and Israel. And the inaccuracy of those rockets in the past has certainly meant that Arab villages in Israel get hit, the West Bank gets hit, and so the Palestinians would certainly be involved. In addition, the collapse of the regime, or even the non-collapse of the regime, but a significant intensification in fighting, would mean refugees coming into Jordan. And Jordan's government is not that stable. If you have thousands of refugees coming across a very wide border that Jordan has with Syria, which is simply indefensible border, you could end up with thousands of militant fighters, heavily armed, coming across the border into Jordan, and suddenly having the Jordanian government not be able to handle that, and being dependent on Israel and the United States to help stop it. So while all this is going on in Syria, the eye is off the ball of what's going on in the Red Sea. And Mark and I work significantly with the Sudanese community, and we pay attention to what's going on in Sudan, which the world seems to be totally ignoring right now. One country that's not ignoring it is Iran. And Iran is building up its bases in Sudan, its connections to Sudan. They're trying to actually create military bases in Sudan. The Sudanese government is apprehensive about that. The main reason the Sudanese government is apprehensive about that is because it could potentially involve them in a war with Israel instead of minor altercations here and there, or a war with the United States. The Sudanese government knows full well that everybody and their brother wants to oust the Bashir regime from power. They don't need to give extra incentive to do that, and so we're in a situation here where Iran is trying to use Sudan as a southern base of operations, and if you look at a map, you will see that having Port Sudan as an Iranian military base gives Iran just as much control over the Red Sea all the way up to the Suez Canal, and functionally including all traffic going through the Suez Canal, as the United States has influence in the Persian Gulf. That would be extremely bad. People don't realize just how bad that is. The United States nor Israel can possibly allow Iran to establish a major naval base, an air base in Sudan to use against traffic going through the Red Sea, nor can they allow lots and lots of militants to establish themselves there. We're going to be seeing these things develop
relatively quickly
over the next few weeks. Now, next weekend is the American Israel Public Affairs Policy Conference in Washington, D.C., and there always are issues that come up at that conference that will be relevant. We'll talk about those when we get back. And things with Syria will continue to develop. As of today, from here in Des Moines, the best advice I can give people is to stay warm and stay safe as Snowmageddon hits us this afternoon. It's Storm Q, I think they're calling it. Have a wonderful week. Have a wonderful weekend. Happy Purim for all those Jews who are celebrating Purim. And Hag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining us.